Hey, fellowship. Glad y'all are joining us for this post-sermon chat. We covered a lot of ground in Ephesians, didn't we? We talked about wives submitting to husbands, husbands loving their wives as the avenue for respect, wives respecting their husbands as an avenue to submission. We talked about kids obeying parents and parents not exasperating children and slaves and masters being more concerned about what God says and sees than what others see, and then all of that was kind of couched in this idea of being wise and not foolish, and embracing God in life instead of escaping life. And the on our website, the online church, somebody made the comment, the way they phrased it, I thought was so good. They talked about instead of escaping from, it's escaping to. So instead of escaping from life, it's escaping to our life in God. And I thought that was wonderfully put. What I'd love for you to do is if you have any questions for me, anything you want to talk about, go ahead and post those. But I also want to highlight something that I was told that I completely neglected at the end of the service. Something that I do every week, and I mean it, and even when I finished the service, I stood up here thinking that I was missing something, and they told me what it was. I didn't say, I love you, and I love being in the church with you. So, let me say it to be clear. Y'all, I love you, and I love being in the church with you, and so I'm so glad that you are here. So, what questions do y'all have? I would love to be able to answer those. I'd love to know, too, what did you think about this idea of submitting ourselves to one another as the kind of the umbrella over those husband and wives and parents and kids and slaves and masters, submitting ourselves one to another. What do you think that looks like in today's church life? What does submitting ourselves one to another look like? I would love to know your thoughts on that or any other questions that you may have. Because I've got some thoughts, but I'd love to hear yours. Let's see, Fred, while we appreciate those phrases, Fred, our household is more partial to the Fred wave. That, yeah, that's fun. That's fun. What questions do you have? What thoughts do you have? I'd love to hear from you. And in particularly, what do you think it looks like to submit ourselves one to another? Let's talk about that. Gosh, there was something I was going to say as people type out their stuff, and it has escaped me. I will say I have a plan to put this message into application this afternoon by taking a nap, because y'all, I am wore out, and here's why. I don't know if you can see behind me, but there's trim on the staging, which we had 4 volunteers work on this weekend. Billy and his wife, Annie Rimple, and then Eric and Emily Watson. Billy and Annie worked on the trim, and Eric and Emily finished off the steps on the stage. We've redone the stage in the past year, and so they had to sand it and do a whole bunch of stuff. Now, you might be asking, why am I tired from them doing that? Because I got the trim, I got it painted, did some other stuff, and so it was just a long weekend. We went to IKEA yesterday, which I will tell you, for the future, if we ever get a stimulus check again, don't go to IKEA the Saturday after everybody got their stimulus check. Y'all, the building was the line was wrapped around the building. It was crazy to get in. But when you drive from here to IKEA, like, you're going to stand in line. You're not just going to turn around and walk out. Turn around and walk away because you're committed. So we were committed and stayed there, and I don't care how good the meatballs are, they're not worth that long of a line. But we got some other stuff too. So, all right, let's see. We got some stuff coming in. I would love to respond to it. Let's see. Amy says, submitting is hard. It means you have to surrender what you want. Yes, Amy, and she said this on our online platform, and I'll get to the Facebook stuff in just a minute. So submitting is hard, but here's what you have to understand too. Submitting is you willingly giving up that power and that control. That's what makes it hard, because you see what you're giving up. But here's what's also a key to submission is that in submission, you hold all the power because you're the one that's willingly submitting, and you can give it up or you cannot. But it is very hard to do that. And that's why I think Paul speaks to the gospel in those and shows, for a person to willingly give up their power and to give up their control, because that's what submission is, they're doing that in hopes that the other person will let the gospel impact them. So a wife's job is to respect her husband. A husband's job is to love their wives. And when those two things happen, submitting becomes easier. Not easy, but easier. Julie says it means letting go of the need to compete with each other or to prove yourself. Yes, Julie, that is exactly true. There's actually one sentence that I think is very important that I forgot when I was talking about rest. And I said that, the world doesn't have to be perfect. Your job doesn't have to be perfect. Your house doesn't have to be perfect. Your kids don't have to be perfect so that you can rest. The sentence I forgot is that you don't have to be perfect. I don't have to be perfect so we can rest. And so that in and of itself, that freedom to not be perfect, lets go of a whole lot of need to compete, right? Because you're not competing against the other person. You're not competing against your spouse. You don't have to be perfect. Lisa says, such a great sermon and one that I have been struggling and working with for the last year. I'm happy to say that having Christ in my life now has made my private life more in line with my public life. That's great, Alyssa. And something I don't feel I have to hide anymore. I still have some problems with Netflix, though, LOL. Well, I mean, first of all, admitting it is the biggest step because here's what I found. In a church environment, in a group environment, when people admit that they don't have it together, it gives everyone the freedom to admit the same thing because none of us have it together, right? All of us have a private life and public life that is divided in some way, no matter how hard we work at it. I work very hard at that. I try not to be the pastor who's one way up here and another way in private. If you know Fred, you get the same Fred in person as you do in private, and that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. But there's still a division there, and that's where Jesus is still working in you and in me, and when we do that together, I think it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Let's go over to Facebook real quick and see what people are saying there. Rusty Mitchell. Hey, Rusty. Thanks for joining us online. I think I saw earlier you were from Highlands, I think is where you are. Let's see. Submitting has to be a process because of flesh and spirit. I desire the spirit to win. Yes, that's a great way to put it, Rusty. It is a battle between the flesh and the spirit, and we do want the spirit to win. Next week in Ephesians, we get to talk about the armor of God. And how important that is in that spiritual battle. And here's what we have to keep in mind about the armor of God next week. When Paul's talking to the church, he's talking about that armor of God that we have together. Now, I know, like I said, in our culture, we read the scriptures very individualistically. What does this mean for me? That idea was very uncommon when the scriptures were written. It was a lot of y'all language. And so that idea of the church putting on the armor of God and the individuals as well, but the church putting on the power of God, the armor of God, that is powerful and really cool. And I'm looking forward to doing that because that is when, as we're mutually submitting to one another and as together as we're putting on the armor of God, that's what helps the Spirit win. And so Rusty, I pray that for you. Let's see, on the website, Church Online, Amy Flagler says, and of course that is what Jesus did. Let's see, submitting to harm means you have to surrender what you want. And of course, yes, I was looking back at your previous comment to see where that tagged because, that was 2 comments ago. And in the world of pandemic, 2 comments ago was like last year, right? Yes, that is what Jesus did. He surrendered his power, Philippians 2. That he did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, right? But instead emptied himself. And so he definitely surrendered his power. And that surrendering, if Jesus did it, that means that power's in you to do the same thing. And so that escaping to Jesus, turning to Jesus, embracing life in Jesus is critical to that. Yes, that's what I meant. That's what I figured. Yes, thank you for, I'm glad I got it right. Any other thoughts or comments? Thank y'all for sticking around. So here's what's interesting to me. Y'all, nobody's talking about submitting. Like, we're talking about it in general terms that it's hard. But what do you think about what Paul says? Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives in a sacrificial way as Christ loved the church. Kids, obey your parents. And listen, here's what's interesting. We have teenagers in our time. Paul didn't have teenagers, right? Like that you went from being a child to being an adult in the Jewish frame of mind. And now we have teenagers, and that could last anywhere up to, in your 30s. What that word that he's using, children, obey your parents, is for children, not teenagers, not adults. That's why honoring your parents is timeless. And seeing the best in your parents is timeless. Fathers, don't exasperate your children. As fathers, don't exasperate your little kids. Because as adults and teenagers, there's different scriptures that speak to that and how to deal with anger. With Paul looking into this system of slavery that existed in his day. Now, he's not condoning it, but he's speaking into it. And he's saying, hey, this is what the gospel says in that environment. In that environment, it means if you're a slave, it means that you seek to submit and put yourself under the authority of your master, and you're sincere in what you do. You don't try to be manipulative. Masters, if you are a Jesus follower, you don't threaten your slaves. You take fear out of that relationship. And instead, you realize that God is watching. Now, keep in mind, this was to a church of people. And so slaves got to hear Paul address their masters to not threaten them. Like, that had to empower them and had to be able to unify them in some way for those who followed Jesus. But I would love to know, like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, that stuff, as I studied that and got more into it, it got more and more scandalous for me. And how does the gospel speak into relationships that we have and structures that we have? What does the gospel say about politics? Like, I wonder how Paul would address that. What does the gospel say to marriages now? Because he wasn't speaking to a hierarchy in marriage that is I don't think that is prescribed for all eternity. I think he's mentioning something that's he's describing something. I'm not sure that he's prescribing something. So what would he say to marriages today? Like, how does the gospel speak into those marriages today? What would he say to families today? What would he say to singles today? What would the gospel say to some other different structures? I'd be curious to know what your thoughts on that are. And if there aren't any, y'all can just email them to me later. But I'll give it a little bit, and then we'll shut down. But I would love to know what your thoughts are. Well, if thoughts come in, great. If not, that's okay too. Brian Bridges says, thanks for a great practical sermon this morning, Fred, and great worship. You're very welcome. I hope y'all are doing well as you anticipate the arrival of your second child. Let me know if y'all have any questions. Otherwise, let's see. Amy Flagler says, I had not thought about not really having teenagers back then. Yeah, isn't that an interesting thought? They just didn't, once you hit a certain age, you were considered an adult, and that was a really young age, right? And so they went from being a kid to being an adult. Now, there may be some nuances there, but certainly not like we have. We have a huge era of teenagers as where they're learning to be adults. And so, what would the gospel say? If Paul was writing today, what would he say to teenagers today? Because I think it'd be something a little bit different. Who knows? Who knows? Lisa says, I'm not married, so it's easier to bring up the comment you made about what to do if you don't love and honor your spouse. Yeah, Elise, thanks for bringing that back up. What do you do if you don't love and honor your spouse? Here's the first thing I would ask you to do. is to focus on what Paul says to you um, uh, about respecting your spouse, to men about loving your spouse, and like do a deep dive there. And are you doing that? Because maybe not. Maybe you're focusing on other things. Now, this is assuming that your spouse is trying hard to love you back, right? Like this is assuming a lot, which is also why I said, if that's true, come talk to me, because all of these are complicated, right? Every different relationship that God's put me in to try and help, they're always different and they're always complicated. But it's easy to go back and as we talk about and re-engage, draw a circle around yourself, and what's God doing in that circle? Like that's the key part of this. And then you'll discover that actually changes a relationship. When you change what's happening in the circle around you, it changes those relationships outside of you. So if people want, we can talk about that. We can have those conversations and see what God can do to help. But that's kind of the first place, is to start with you. Let's see. Stacy says, speak to women who have a husband who is not a follower of Christ or is a believer but abusive. Oh, okay. My wife's just jumping right in. All right. So here's the deal. If you're married and your husband's not a believer, God's word says that you bring a level of sanctification into that house. And so just by being in that house, you make the house more holy, because you're bringing Jesus with you, and you're bringing the goodness that he brings and the light that he brings into a house that wasn't there before. And so that changes things. You also have to remember that if you're a believer and your spouse isn't, your spouse doesn't have the Holy Spirit indwelling in them. And so the things that upset you, the things that bother you, may not bother them, right? Because y'all have two different power sources. Think of it this way. Think of it that way. And so that just requires a whole lot of grace and a whole lot of patience and a whole lot of love. And it requires a whole lot of prayer. And so gather people around you that are like-minded believers and pray together and draw encouragement for them, and then go home and love and respect your spouse. Now, if your spouse is abusive, that's a whole different category, right? Paul's making some assumptions here that spouses are trying to live this out. And as we all know, that's not the case in every relationship. That's not the case in every marriage. And if your spouse is abusive and it's not safe for you to physically be there, then getting out is okay. You know, that's what setting boundaries are for, and then letting your spouse prove that they want to do the work to rebuild the relationship, that's okay. Now, that too is very, very nuanced, and the way to do that in a godly way is very, very nuanced. And so if that's you, please reach out to me, or reach out to one of the elders, or reach out to one of our growth group leaders, and let us help you in that. Because staying in an abusive home, if it's not a safe place, it's not a safe place. And let's do what we can to help in that. That's, if it's physically abusive. If it's emotionally abusive, again, that's a very nuanced, very, very nuanced environment. And so we'd love to talk and walk with you through that. So I hope that's helpful. Stacy, baby, tell me if that was helpful, babe. All right. If not, then either text me or put a question here to refine what I said. So let me know. If your spouse leaves and starts another family, new children, and new life outside of marriage, then I would say you are free. If your spouse has left and they are starting another family with someone else, you are free. Free to move on and see what God has for you in the next chapter, because they've made a very clear declaration. To them, the marriage is broken and the marriage is off. And if you've done everything you can, and at that point, I think the door has closed for you to do everything you can. If they are in another relationship and starting another family, you're free to pursue what God has for you next. I hope that's helpful. Oh, Stacy says, yeah. So I guess I answered the question. Great. All right, this is good stuff. Good stuff. Anything else? All right. Well, if you do want to reach out to me, then email me, fred@fellowshipasheville.com. And if I can't see you in a reasonable amount of time, because my schedule does fill up, I will refer you to someone who I know can help you. All right? Church, I love you, and I love being the church with you. Sorry I didn't say it this morning, but it's still true. I love you, and I love being the church with you. So I will see you next time.